One woman walked out of the hospital after everyone else was gone, and the American soldiers waiting outside couldn't understand why she was carrying a ring of keys instead of asking for help. She looked exhausted, her white nurse's uniform stained by days without rest. Yet her first words were not about herself. "Count them again," she said quietly. "No one is left inside." The young sergeant frowned because every report insisted the building had been abandoned 2 days earlier. If that was true, who had kept the lights burning through the shattered windows every night? Who had been changing bandages when the doctors were gone? And why did every wounded man inside, no matter which uniform he had worn before the fighting ended, speak about the same silent nurse with the same look of disbelief? The answers would force an entire American unit to question everything they thought they knew about the enemy. 3 days earlier, before that door ever opened, the hospital had already been written off as a place beyond saving. The hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp plaster. Candles had replaced electric lights. Rain tapped softly against cracked glass, while distant engines rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Most of the staff had already evacuated with the last medical convoy, carrying what little medicine they could fit into a pair of overloaded trucks. The patients who could stand had left on their own. The ones who could not were expected to wait for whatever came next. Anna Keller stood alone in the supply room, counting the remaining bandages one careful stack at a time. 12 clean rolls. 4 bottles of penicillin. Less than a gallon of fresh water. A notebook filled with names written in neat handwriting. She paused only long enough to close her eyes before lifting another crate onto the table. Outside, footsteps hurried toward the entrance. An older physician, his coat folded over one arm, stopped beside her with quiet urgency. "Anna," he said, "the last transport is leaving now." She looked toward the narrow hallway where soft voices drifted from the recovery ward. Someone was calling for water. Another patient coughed behind a closed curtain. She picked up the notebook instead of her suitcase. "The last patient hasn't left," she answered. The doctor stared at her for a long second, searching for words that might change her mind, but he found none. He simply nodded once, placed his own stethoscope beside her supplies, and walked away without another sentence. A few minutes later, the sound of the departing truck faded into the distance, leaving only rain, slow breathing, and the quiet certainty that one nurse had just chosen to remain inside a building everyone else believed had already been forgotten. Morning arrived without birdsong. The silence outside felt heavier than the clouds hanging over the valley, as though the world itself had paused to listen for something that no longer existed. Anna Keller lit another candle before the first one had completely burned out, conserving every match with careful hands. The thin flame pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal rows of iron beds, neatly folded blankets, and faces still waiting for the next quiet reassurance that someone had not forgotten them. She moved from one bedside to another with measured steps, checking temperatures, changing dressings, offering small sips of water that had become more valuable than medicine itself. Every motion was deliberate. Every supply was counted twice before it was used once. There was no room for waste anymore. A young patient watched her refill a cracked enamel cup and asked in a tired voice, "Are they coming back?" Anna looked toward the empty entrance before answering. "Someone always comes." She did not know whether she believed those words, but she understood that hope sometimes worked like medicine. It only needed to last until tomorrow. Hours passed inside a building where clocks had stopped keeping accurate time. Rainwater dripped steadily into a metal bucket near the entrance, creating a slow rhythm that echoed through the corridors. Anna collected every drop she could, filtering it through clean cloth before carrying it carefully from bed to bed. She paused beside an elderly man who apologized for needing help. She answered with the same calm expression she offered everyone else. "You have nothing to apologize for." The sentence was simple, almost ordinary, yet it settled over the room like warmth on a cold morning. Outside, distant engines occasionally rolled across the countryside, fading before they ever came close. Nobody inside knew who controlled the roads anymore. Rumors had replaced reliable news. Some whispered that American forces were only a few miles away. Others insisted more fighting would continue for weeks. Anna listened to none of it. The only distance that mattered to her was the few steps between one patient and the next. By late afternoon, she discovered the final crate of clean linens contained fewer blankets than she remembered. She quietly removed her own wool coat, folded it, and spread it over the shoulders of a patient whose hands would not stop trembling from the cold. The evening air slipped through broken windows, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Somewhere beyond the hills, history continued moving forward. Inside the hospital, time seemed to stand perfectly still, held together by one woman who refused to measure human worth by uniforms, flags, or the outcome of a war that had already taken more than enough. The second night arrived colder than the first. The rain had stopped, leaving the air strangely clear, and through the broken windows Anna Keller could see stars scattered above the dark hills, as if the world beyond the hospital had forgotten there was still a war. Inside, every sound carried farther than before. A spoon touched the side of a porcelain cup. A blanket rustled as someone turned in restless sleep. A candle flickered whenever the wind found another crack in the old walls. Anna moved quietly through the ward, trimming wicks to make each candle last a little longer. She had begun measuring time not by hours, but by flames. One candle meant another round of medicine. 2 candles meant it was time to check every bandage again. 3 candles meant morning could not be far away. Near midnight, a faint knock echoed from the front entrance. It was so soft that she almost believed she had imagined it. She carried a lantern through the empty corridor and opened the heavy wooden door only a few inches. A teenage messenger stood outside, soaked from the evening mist, holding a folded piece of paper. He explained that every remaining medical station farther east had already been evacuated. Roads were closing. Bridges were no longer considered safe for civilian travel. Anyone still inside the hospital should leave before sunrise. Anna thanked him, accepted the note, and watched him disappear into the darkness without asking his name. She closed the door, unfolded the paper, read the instructions once, then placed it beneath the leg of an uneven table without another glance. In the recovery ward, one of the patients noticed the lantern in her hand. "Was it bad news?" he asked. Anna smiled with quiet honesty. It was only another reminder to hurry. The man looked toward the doorway, expecting her to begin packing supplies. Instead, she reached for fresh cloth, warmed water over a small stove, and continued her work exactly as before. Dawn arrived wrapped in pale gray light. Outside, the road remained empty except for abandoned wagons and branches scattered by the storm. Anna stepped into the courtyard carrying 2 metal buckets, filling them from a rain barrel before the morning breeze could cover the surface with leaves. As she returned inside, she paused for the first time in days. Far beyond the distant tree line, almost too faint to recognize, came the steady hum of engines unlike any she had heard before. They were organized, disciplined, moving closer 1 measured mile at a time. She stood perfectly still, listening until the sound settled into certainty. Then she carried the water back inside, placed it beside the nearest bed, and resumed her rounds as though the approaching convoy changed nothing at all. For her, there was still another temperature to check, another blanket to straighten, another frightened voice waiting to hear that someone had not forgotten them. The sound grew louder with every passing minute until it no longer blended with the wind. It rolled steadily across the valley, measured and disciplined, neither hurried nor hesitant. Inside the hospital, no one spoke about it. Some patients closed their eyes as if refusing to guess what waited beyond the hills. Others stared toward the windows, listening with quiet acceptance. Anna Keller simply folded another clean cloth, placed it beside a basin of warm water, and continued checking each patient exactly as she had done the day before. The engines finally stopped somewhere beyond the front gate. Silence followed, heavier than the sound itself. A few moments later came careful footsteps across loose gravel, then the slow creak of the rusted entrance gate. Sergeant Thomas Walker raised one hand, signaling the small American patrol behind him to remain outside. Every briefing they had received claimed the hospital had already been abandoned. Windows were broken. Part of the roof had collapsed. No smoke rose from the chimney. It looked like another empty building left behind by a retreating army. Then he noticed something impossible. A single candle flickered behind a second-floor window. Someone was still inside. Thomas pushed open the heavy wooden door with cautious hands. The hinges groaned softly into the quiet corridor. Dust floated through pale morning light. The air carried the familiar scent of antiseptic mixed with melted candle wax and freshly boiled water. He expected confusion. He expected panic. Instead, he found order. Beds were lined neatly against the walls. Blankets had been folded with remarkable care. Basins of clean water rested beside every patient. The room felt less like a forgotten battlefield hospital and more like a place where someone refused to surrender ordinary human dignity. At the far end of the ward, a woman stood beside an elderly patient, adjusting a blanket that had slipped from tired shoulders. She did not turn immediately when she heard unfamiliar boots on the wooden floor. She finished tucking the blanket beneath the mattress first. Only then did she slowly face the visitors. Thomas noticed exhaustion before anything else. Dark circles framed her eyes. Loose strands of blonde hair had escaped beneath her white nursing cap. Her hands were red from constant washing, yet they remained perfectly steady. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence carried no threat, only surprise. Thomas lowered his rifle until it rested harmlessly against his shoulder. Anna looked directly at him with calm blue eyes that held neither fear nor resentment. Then, in careful English, she asked the first question. "Do you have a doctor with you?" Thomas blinked, caught completely off guard. After everything he expected to hear that morning, concern for herself was not among them. She had not asked who they were. She had not asked what would happen next. She had only asked whether someone else could finally help the people she had spent days refusing to leave behind. Thomas Walker answered without taking his eyes off the patients. "There is a medic outside, and there is a field surgeon with the convoy about half a mile behind us." Anna nodded once, as though that single sentence had lifted a weight she had been carrying for days. "Please bring them in first," she said quietly. "The man by the window has a fever. The young one in the corner has not been able to keep water down since yesterday. The others are stable if they continue resting." She spoke with the calm precision of someone giving a routine morning report instead of standing before soldiers from the opposing side. Thomas looked around the room again. Every bed was occupied. Every blanket had been adjusted. Small handwritten cards rested beside each patient with names, temperatures, and careful notes recorded in neat handwriting. He picked up one of the cards and noticed that the entries continued without interruption through every day of the previous week. There had been no doctors left, no support staff, no regular deliveries. Yet someone had continued documenting every change as though the hospital still operated under ordinary conditions. His medic entered a few moments later carrying a canvas medical bag. Before the young corporal could ask where to begin, Anna was already walking beside him. She introduced every patient by name instead of rank. She described symptoms instead of uniforms. She never once mentioned which army they had belonged to. The medic glanced toward Thomas with quiet confusion before kneeling beside the first bed exactly where Anna directed him. The room settled into a rhythm that needed almost no conversation. Bandages were unwrapped. Fresh water was poured into enamel cups. Thermometers were checked against candlelight. Boots crossed the wooden floor beside soft footsteps until it became difficult to tell which hands belonged to Americans and which belonged to the woman who had kept the hospital alive alone. Thomas remained near the center of the ward, saying almost nothing. He had spent nearly 3 years learning how to recognize danger in silence. Yet this silence felt entirely different. It was not built from fear. It was built from purpose. At one point, he noticed Anna remove the last clean towel from a cabinet and fold it beneath the head of a sleeping patient. She glanced toward the empty shelf for only a second before quietly tearing a clean strip from the inside lining of her own apron to replace the missing cloth. She performed the small task so naturally that no one else in the room appeared to notice. Thomas did. He also noticed the untouched cup of coffee sitting near the small stove, now completely cold. Beside it rested a slice of bread that had hardened with time. It suddenly became obvious that while everyone inside had been receiving care, the one person responsible for all of it had quietly forgotten to care for herself. The field surgeon arrived less than 20 minutes later, carrying 2 heavy canvas cases while another medic pushed a folding stretcher through the front entrance. The hallway that had seemed forgotten only an hour before suddenly filled with quiet purpose. Fresh supplies were unpacked onto wooden tables. Clean blankets appeared from the convoy outside. Glass bottles of medicine caught the pale morning light. Yet before anyone touched a patient, the surgeon removed his gloves, walked directly to Anna Keller, and asked a simple question. "Who needs us first?" She did not hesitate. She pointed toward the far corner where an elderly man rested beneath the blanket she had straightened only minutes earlier. "Him," she answered. Then the young man by the window. The others can wait a little longer. The surgeon nodded without questioning her judgment. Thomas Walker noticed the exchange with growing admiration. Rank had not decided who led the room. Knowledge had. Compassion had. The American medical team followed Anna from one bedside to the next as though they had worked beside her for years. She remembered every fever, every restless night, every cup of water each patient had managed to drink. When the surgeon asked when one patient had last slept peacefully, Anna answered without opening her notebook. Yesterday morning, just after sunrise. About 40 minutes. When another medic searched for additional dressings, she quietly reached beneath a cabinet and revealed a small bundle she had hidden for emergencies. She had planned every remaining supply with extraordinary care, stretching each roll of bandage and every bottle of medicine far beyond what anyone believed possible. Thomas stepped outside for the first time since entering the hospital. More trucks had arrived behind the patrol. Soldiers waited for instructions beside parked ambulances while drivers checked engines that continued idling in the cool air. His commanding officer approached with a clipboard already in hand. "We can evacuate the patients within the hour," the captain said. "After that we secure the building and move on." Thomas looked back through the open doorway where Anna was helping lift a patient onto a clean stretcher. She moved slowly now. The confidence remained, but exhaustion had begun to show in every step. He realized she had spent days carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to an entire staff. "No," Thomas answered quietly. "We are not leaving in an hour." The captain frowned. "Lieutenant Colonel Harris wants the convoy moving before noon." Thomas kept watching the woman inside the ward as another patient reached for her hand before being wheeled toward the ambulance. "Then Lieutenant Colonel Harris can wait," he replied. "We stay until every patient is safe, every record is accounted for, and every room has been checked twice." The captain studied him for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Within minutes, the order spread through the convoy. Instead of preparing to depart, more medics entered the hospital. More blankets were carried inside. More water was unloaded. For the first time in days, Anna stopped looking over her shoulder because she finally knew she was no longer carrying the hospital alone. By early afternoon, the hospital no longer sounded like a place waiting to be abandoned. Footsteps echoed steadily through the corridors. Stretchers rolled carefully across worn wooden floors. Quiet voices replaced anxious whispers. Outside, ambulance doors opened and closed with patient rhythm, while soldiers carried crates of blankets, bottled water, and medical supplies into rooms that had survived for days on almost nothing. One by one, the patients were prepared for evacuation. No one was rushed. No one was overlooked. Before each stretcher left the ward, Anna Keller paused beside the bed, checked the handwritten record one final time, adjusted the blanket with familiar hands, and softly repeated each patient's name to the medic receiving them. Thomas Walker noticed that she never said, "Take him." She always said, "His name is Carl," or "Her name is Elise." It was a small difference, but it reminded everyone listening that they were moving people, not numbers. As another ambulance departed down the muddy road, Thomas unfolded Anna's worn notebook. Every page carried the same careful handwriting. Temperatures, medicines, water intake, hours of sleep, small observations that only someone paying constant attention would notice. Beside one patient's name she had written, "Smiled for the first time today after hearing birds outside." Another page simply read, "Asked whether spring flowers had returned." Thomas stopped reading for a moment. There were no dramatic words, no complaints, no mention of fear, only quiet evidence that someone had refused to let ordinary human moments disappear, even while the world outside continued changing beyond those walls. By late afternoon, only one patient remained inside the ward, an elderly schoolteacher whose weakened breathing made transportation more difficult than expected. The field surgeon suggested waiting another hour before moving him. Anna agreed without argument. She pulled a chair beside the bed and sat silently while sunlight drifted through the cracked windows, turning floating dust into ribbons of gold. No one spoke. There was nothing left that required words. When the surgeon finally nodded, the stretcher was rolled gently into place. Thomas and another medic lifted the patient with practiced care while Anna steadied the blanket around his shoulders. The old man slowly opened his eyes and searched the room until he found her standing beside the doorway. "Are you coming too?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen since entering the hospital. In just a moment, she answered. The ambulance doors closed softly, and the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees. Silence returned once again. Anna walked through every empty room alone, straightening one abandoned chair, extinguishing each remaining candle, closing every cabinet, and placing her notebook carefully inside her worn leather satchel. Only after checking every bed, every hallway, and every corner one final time did she walk toward the entrance where Thomas waited without saying a word. She reached for the heavy iron keys hanging beside the door, locked the building with slow, steady hands, and slipped the keys into his open palm. Now, she said quietly, looking back at the silent ward one last time. Everyone has gone. The convoy did not leave until the sun had begun sinking behind the distant hills, washing the sky with soft shades of amber and gray. The road ahead stretched quietly through fields that were beginning to show the first signs of spring. Inside the lead ambulance, the patients rested beneath clean blankets while American medics checked temperatures and offered water at regular intervals. For the first time in days, no one inside the vehicles wondered whether help would arrive before nightfall. It already had. Anna Keller rode in the last truck, not because anyone had assigned her there, but because she insisted on remaining close enough to answer questions about every patient if another doctor needed information. The notebook rested on her lap, its worn leather cover marked by rain, candle wax, and countless careful hands. Thomas Walker climbed into the seat across from her, holding the heavy ring of hospital keys she had entrusted to him only an hour earlier. Neither of them spoke for several miles. The quiet between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt earned. Eventually, Thomas opened the notebook again, this time reading from the very first page instead of the most recent entries. What he found surprised him even more than the hospital itself. Every patient had been admitted with the same careful attention. Every change had been documented. Every shortage of medicine had been followed by another handwritten plan to make the remaining supplies last one more day. There were no dramatic sentences asking for recognition. There was not a single complaint about exhaustion or fear. Near the back of the notebook, he discovered a folded sheet tucked carefully between two pages. It was the evacuation order delivered 2 mornings earlier. Across the bottom, written in small, steady handwriting, Anna had added only one sentence. Departure delayed until every patient can leave safely. Thomas looked up from the page and studied the woman sitting opposite him. She had fallen asleep without realizing it, her hands still resting lightly on the notebook as though she feared someone might need it before she woke. The field surgeon quietly leaned toward Thomas and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know how long she stayed there alone?" Thomas shook his head. The surgeon glanced back toward the sleeping nurse before answering. Based on the records, at least 4 full days after the last physician left. She rationed medicine, collected rainwater, maintained every chart, and somehow kept everyone stable until we arrived. Thomas slowly closed the notebook. Outside the truck window, evening settled peacefully across the countryside. He had crossed oceans expecting to measure courage by battles, commands, and medals. Instead, he had found it written in careful pencil marks, folded blankets, cooled cups of untouched coffee, and the quiet decision of one exhausted nurse who never once believed that her own safety should come before the people still waiting for her care. Many years passed before Sergeant Thomas Walker spoke about the hospital again. Friends asked him about campaigns, medals, long marches, and impossible days that history books would later describe in careful detail. He answered those questions politely, but never for very long. Instead, his thoughts always returned to one quiet building where the loudest sound had been the turning of notebook pages and the steady footsteps of a woman who refused to leave while another human being still needed her. On an autumn afternoon nearly 3 decades later, Thomas visited a military medical museum during a reunion with former medics. Glass cases displayed worn surgical instruments, faded uniforms, field radios, and weathered maps covered with careful pencil marks. Visitors moved slowly from one exhibit to another, speaking in respectful whispers. Near the end of the gallery, Thomas stopped before a small wooden display that almost everyone else walked past without noticing. Inside rested an old leather notebook, its pages open beneath protective glass. Beside it lay a ring of heavy iron keys. There was no long explanation, no dramatic headline, only a short description explaining that the notebook had documented every patient inside an isolated wartime hospital until evacuation became possible. Thomas smiled quietly. He recognized the handwriting before reading a single word. A young nursing student standing beside him noticed the expression on his face. "Did you know the person who wrote that?" she asked. Thomas looked at the notebook for a long moment before answering. "Only for one day," he said. But that was enough. The student studied the careful notes inside the faded pages. "Was she famous?" Thomas slowly shook his head. "No," he replied. "Most people never heard her name." The young woman looked surprised. "Then why preserve her notebook?" Thomas rested one hand lightly against the polished wooden rail beneath the display. "Because sometimes history remembers battles," he said softly. "But civilization survives because someone quietly changes a bandage, shares the last cup of water, straightens a blanket, and refuses to walk away." The student remained silent, her eyes returning to the worn pages beneath the glass. Thomas took one final look at the notebook before turning toward the exit. Outside, afternoon sunlight stretched across the museum steps, warm and peaceful in a world that had long since healed from many old scars. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and walked away carrying no photograph, no souvenir, and no medal from that memory. He did not need one. Some acts of courage were never meant to be celebrated with applause. They were meant to become quiet standards by which others measured themselves. And long after names faded and uniforms disappeared, the truest victories would still belong to those who chose compassion when no one was watching, proving that the quiet ones were never truly ordinary.